Neil McMahon, who in fact is our next speaker. And over the last 18 months, 2 years, Neil has gracefully exited Bernstein, bought most of Kent with his wallet, and is now involved in a company called Kimmeridge Energy, which is beginning to think, how do you extend the learnings from that Rob talked about and the technology growth and so on to, in particular, shale oils, perhaps in particular shale oils around the world. So, Neil, please, over to you.
Thanks very much, David. First, thank you for sitting here and about to listen to me. Secondly, I'd like to thank some of the other authors of this presentation, which we've given at a few conferences. In particular, Marlon Downey, who many of you might know in the room, a very experienced explorationist and geochemist, and Alex Inkster, who's in the audience, who works along with me at Kimmeridge Energy. As David said, Kimmeridge Energy is a relatively new company, but we've been in existence in terms of investing in oil and gas for a number of years. We are exclusively investing in unconventional oil and gas through private equity funds, but instead of the typical private equity offering, we invest directly in oil and gas. We don't back management teams of E&P companies. So we're in effect an oil and gas company, but raise money through private equity funds. We've got operations in North America, and we've got a number of license applications in Europe, and we're currently expanding and going outside those areas as well. What I want to take you through, there we go, today is two things. First of all, following on from some of Rob's discussions, looking at what is our view of the global opportunity set, and doing this from geological and petrophysical and geochemical first principles. Secondly, and it's a good point James brought up actually, is defining what we consider the core of shale plays. We would argue that the science of unconventional oil and gas recovery, looking at shales or adjacent reservoir units, be they dolomites and other forms of carbonates, is embryonic. And anybody says that they know it for sure, I think even the great Dan Jarvie would agree that the science behind this is just starting. I think you will see very soon there are massive debates going on at the minute in the academic world between what is kerogen porosity. I'm not going to go into that today. I can touch upon it. But in terms of, does kerogen porosity increase with maturity or decrease with maturity? On other critical fundamental factors when you're looking at extracting oil, in particular oil, from unconventional reservoir rocks. So first of all, what I'd like to do is to define what we see as the global opportunity set. And what we've done here is effectively looked at the mass balance equations for basins across the world. And I'll show you how we got there. So when you look at the globe, I would argue that there's really only a few places on the globe that you've actually got oil and gas active production today. That's more than just throwing in a few wells and testing to see where the resource actually is. And that's predominantly in Canada and the US, where you've got a learning curve that's been established, where people are looking at producing not just NGLs, as we heard from Rob, but also crude oil. And we're seeing on the ground more and more of a trend towards actual crude oil rather than natural gas liquids, for obvious reasons when you see some of the price implications for NGLs in the US. Also, gas drilling's taken a bit of a hit recently because of the gas price. And I think going forward, what we're seeing on the ground is basically nobody is transacting anything in the world of gas, but they're looking all at liquids, and in particular, they're looking at oil. When you look at around the world, you've got a number of different prospective play areas, many of which correlate very closely to proven hydrocarbon basins that have been exploited over the last 150 years. And that's a very good place to start. Effectively, what we're saying in this is that when you look at the recoverable unconventional potential from onshore basins around the world, we believe that it is equivalent to the conventional discovered and produced resources and reserves that we've seen today that have been looked at over the last 150 years. So it's a huge amount, but it's going to take a long time to get it all out of the ground. Very familiar charts looking at what are the current IEA figures for the expectations of oil and gas production in the US and North America, and also looking at the main plays in North America. As Rob mentioned, shale gas currently takes up about a third of North America, and it's going to grow from here, or so say the EIA. I think we would have question marks over that depending on if prices stay at the current levels. You're seeing not only a decrease in the drilling activity of shale gas in the US, but more importantly, you're seeing virtually no capital going into this space at all in terms of from an investment point of view. The investment in shale gas, when you look at it, it started off by companies raising money on the equity markets and through private equity. You secondly saw the big international oil companies piling into this space, paying ridiculous amounts of money to grab acreage in North America. And lastly, you've seen the Asians and Australians piling in to continue the shale gas drilling boom, all of which has dried up now. So what you're left with is basically people trying to hold their lease acreage by production if they can, with money that they've got still in their bank balances, or they've been able to get through some liquids production that they may have. So we could see that plateauing soon. As shale oil, here we only look at really a few of the shale oil plays in the US. Those are the predominant ones today. Really, there only are 2 or 3 in the US I call proper shale oil plays, and that's the Bakken, obviously, the Eagle Ford in the oily part, not the NGL part, and then the Woodford. You may say that there's the Utica. I call it a gas play with associated liquids. If you look at the North American map on the right-hand side, you won't be able to see the different states, but you'll be able to see the blobs. And you may think that, wow, there's a lot of shale gas exploitation in the US, and the US and Canada are done. We're currently looking at 9 plays in the US, none of which you would know the names of, because none of which have been publicized or have seen any unconventional drilling in. So I would say that the market in the US is still incredibly active, and you're going to see lots more, especially in the world of shale oil or tight oil. Right, going right back to basics, and apologies for those in the audience that did their petroleum geology or engineering 30 or 40 years ago and have to sit through this, but I think it's quite important, as not many people have actually done a mass balance work or looked at expulsion efficiency of source rocks since the 1980s or start of the 1990s. In effect, what you've got is conventional oil and gas reserves and production. So the migrated oil that's migrated more than a few meters only represents a very small fraction of the generated oil capacity or gas capacity in a particular basin. So we're talking under 10%. Around about 50% escapes to the surface over geological time in some shape or form, up through faults or simply migrating through rocks. And then you've got around 40 to 50% that still remains associated with the source rock or the adjacent bed. So we're talking about carrier beds a few meters away from the source rock, as well as the source rock itself. How do we get to these numbers? Well, first of all, you have to look at getting back to basics of how oil actually forms in a source rock. This is an area that geochemists have been banging on about for years and years and years, but nobody's ever taken them seriously or frankly cared. Like, why would I care if I'm exploring offshore Angola, drilling David's $200 million wells? Not that he was ever responsible for $200 million wells of BP, but anyway, why would I ever do that when I'm just presuming that the source rock is going to be there and oil is migrated into some sort of turbiditic track? It's actually way, way, way more complicated than a lot of people think in terms of actually how does oil form in a source rock, does it cause porosity, how does it go into cracks, and what is the best area within a source rock to look and frack. So first of all, there are a lot of petrophysical properties you need to look at actually in the source rock itself. I would argue that they're nearly more important than anywhere else in the system, because they are what is causing the oil to form in the first place and through its primary migration. But essentially, you're looking at solid organic layers as you mature and bury them and heat it up. You're starting to get droplets of kerogen, which get into microfractures, and through the microfractures, they can move into larger fractures and then migrate, or they can stay within the source rock itself, expanding its capacity, forming porosity, and getting into adjacent rocks where they will saturate the rock. So we're talking where there is no water at all, because under very high pressures of oil and gas generation, you've squeezed everything out, and you've squeezed the oil and gas into all those microfractures, the very small pore spaces of both the shale and the surrounding rock type. That is what you're aiming for when you're exploring for oil and gas. That's sort of important, but what's even more important is to get down really into what type of hydrocarbon you're dealing with here. We've got three different types in general that most people will know about. You've got the type 3 type of hydrocarbon from a terrestrial point of view, type 2 marine source rocks, and type 1 typically your lacustrine shale types. They've got very different types of hydrogen index, which relate to very different types of expulsion efficiency. So the amount they will expulse, I suppose is the word, out of the source rock, which leads to near migration into adjacent beds or further afield into conventional reservoirs. This is incredibly important when actually trying to track down and look at potential oil and gas unconventional targets. This is work taken from Pepper. Many arguments about whether Pepper's theories are the best in this area. We're using them because they're certainly what we feel is some of the most clear cut. But this is work that was done in the early 90s and late 80s. What's incredible here is that there is a very, very basic science associated with geochemistry and petroleum generation that hasn't evolved very much in the last 20 years. And it's only now that it's really taking off. And it is absolutely fundamental for unconventional oil and gas to be a global phenomenon. One could argue that there's been quite a bit of luck so far to date, and that to expand this across the globe, a lot more science needs to be understood so that the technology can adapt and use that those scientific breakthroughs. There's a huge difference here between if you've got an efficient oil expulsion system, say in a type 1 source rock, so that's a lacustrine shale. So if you look at the end of the oil window, most of the oil has left the source rock and has migrated off either into adjacent rocks or off to form conventional oil. Once you go down towards the gas window, pretty much everything is starting to go in the source rock itself. If you look at an inefficient oil expulsion, or one could argue type 2 fits into this, maybe not inefficient is a very harsh term, you've still got a good chunk of the oil and hydrocarbons still remaining within the source rock through at least the start and middle of the oil window. And these are the best rocks, in our opinion, to go after and offer the best characteristics in terms of the potential for live oil still to remain in the rock. When you look at the expulsion efficiency and you cross-plot it and look at the amount of petroleum generated, you see there is a decent correlation, and we've done this for about 200 basins across the planet now, 200 different petroleum systems, I should say. What you start to see is that there's a relationship between the conventional petroleum that's been discovered and found and yet to find, and the petroleum that's actually been generated in the basin itself. And you can see that in some cases, given the type of source rock, it's been above average, and in a lot of cases, it's been below average. But this is fundamental in calculating how much oil and gas could be remaining around the source rock going forward, and therefore what are the best basins to actually target. When you look at this on a global basis, what you start to find is that for the majority of hydrocarbon systems, you're getting around about 50% of the generated hydrocarbons are remaining in the source rock or very close to the source rock. Around about 5 to 10% have actually migrated and have been trapped in conventional settings, and the rest pretty much has escaped to the surface. Therefore, surface detection techniques, be it from actual seeps or be it through soil monitoring, are going to become incredibly important as we take unconventional exploration to places outside North America where you've got so much well control. We try and target the places which have got the most unconventional potential still remaining around the source rock, as long as it's got the right petrophysical signature and geochemical signature. What you start to see in North America then, that if you look at the basins, and we've classified this through our own work, so these are not the recoverable potential, these are the in-place potential. You see that you've got a number of areas which seem pretty obvious but haven't been exploited to their full extent yet as unconventional plays. As you may have seen on Rob's slide, there, the Shublik Shale is one of the number of shales along the North Slope petroleum system in Alaska. That has got a huge potential. The big issue up there is the cost of extraction, which is incredibly high, since you not only, given the volumes of oil you're talking about per well, you're going to have to heat a hell of a lot of pipe to get the oil out of the ground. And secondly, there are major issues with going too far away from the Trans-Alaskan pipeline. So that's one of the areas why it hasn't really taken off. Although there has been Great Bear and others have looked into this and are planning on drilling around the pipeline over the coming years. But that offers the most potential. When you go down the list, the Utica obviously is one that's taking off, although that is seemingly more gas and NGL rich, right down to your usual suspects of the Bakken, the Marcellus, the Barnett. Right at the bottom, you've got the Monterey in California, which, because of its petrophysical qualities, has yet to be a major player in the unconventional oil world or gas world, although there's quite a lot of work that's getting done on that at the minute by Occidental. There we go. Now, internationally, in our estimate, now, strangely, similar to Rob, what you've got is the Basinov Shale comes up number one. It is just huge, no other way to describe it. It's got some of the best characteristics in the world from a resource play. We believe it was the primary reason behind the Exxon Rosneft deal that was given the headlines of exploring in the Arctic and a sort of small print of exploring in Western Siberia. We think it was all to do with exploring in Western Siberia, as sort of Rob alluded to some degree as well. The Basinov Shale's got huge potential and loads of wells that go through it as well, and recent moves in the Russian government, we suggest that you're going to start to see activity there. Although the mechanisms for the economic mechanisms of recovering oil from the Basinov Shale probably aren't in place yet. They need a few more tax breaks. Western Canada is another huge area that's only really starting to get going. It was started through the shale gas, but in terms of oil and liquids, it's really only at the cusp of getting going. So we expect Western Canada to be the next big area where you're going to see oil production coming out of North America. You wander through the rest, and many of which came up in Rob's presentation as well. There's plenty of oil and gas out there, and if you look on the right-hand column, there's a heck of a lot of oil and gas potential in and around the source rock, although you're talking recovery factors for oil of around 5%, recovery factors for gas of around 15 to 20%. So big numbers, but a very small recoverable amount versus conventional. So to conclude this part of the talk, we believe that there is a huge potential out there in the world, equivalent to, if not potentially about to surpass, the amount that's been discovered and produced in conventional reservoirs. It's going to take a long time to happen. It's going to take a long time to happen because there are certain geological and exploration skills that you need to have in place, and a lot of trial and error before you get the magic code that allows you to extract the oil and gas in your particular area of focus. Right, so we jump back to the Barnett. If you look at the chart on the left, you don't really need to see the detail too much. All the red dots are wells, and you can see, as Rob put in his presentation, it's absolutely peppered with wells all across the place in the Fort Worth Basin, and you saw that from David's Google Maps slide at the start. Absolutely covered in wells. This was the experimental or learning curve for the industry. So very much seeing wells with spacing of 40 acres or lower. You had initial fracs of 3 to 4 frac stages per well instead of the 40 frac stages per well you're now seeing in various locations across the US. And what you're seeing is basically people trying to find where the core area of the Barnett is, so where it's going to give you the most bang for your buck. And a lot of it was done by trial and error. When you boil it all down and you look at what happened in the Barnett, the Marcellus, the Bakken, the Haynesville, etc., you can actually start to find out that there is an equation that governs the core of a shale play. And that's basically where you've got, if you look on the right-hand side, the right depth, the right thickness, the right mineralogy, the right TOC and maturity, and the right porosity. All of those things need to come together in an equation, which we believe we've got a handle on, to give you the core area. The second thing you need to do is get into that core area very early on. There's not much point getting into the core area at the top of the market, because effectively you're paying a market price for somebody who has established the core initially, and a lot of your upside is gone because you're paying a full price for it. When you get into the core early on, you're looking at paying $75 to $150 an acre in many areas, with royalty rates of 15%. When the core has been fully established and de-risked through drilling activities, you're talking $15,000 to $20,000 an acre and up to 30% royalty rates. So it really makes a lot of sense to get in early and therefore define the core at a very early stage. An interesting thing here, again, sticking with the Barnett, is what is the most important? I think a few years ago, and maybe even today in certain places, if you offered somebody 1,000 foot of shale at an average TOC of 1%, or 200 foot of shale at an average TOC of 5%, a lot of people would have gone for the thicker shale. I would say that's probably wrong. You always want to go for the richer shale and look for the bits within the richer shale that have got the best porosity. There is a natural cutoff limit in terms of thickness, but again, you could pick out different areas, and we've picked Parker and Tarrant County out here, which have got differing, and if you look further to the west, you can see that thickness really starts to fall off rapidly. And if you look on the right, you can actually see that the best part of the Barnett play is where you got the most mature. So this vitrinite reflectance numbers getting up well above 1.3 up to 1.5, 1.7, and diving off to the left. So you're looking for a combination of different things before you start defining your leasing strategy in these plays. What we look at is, as we've mentioned already, we're looking at what is the type of kerogen in the source rock, because it's critical in terms of the expulsion efficiency. It's also critical for a number of factors in terms of in the maturity profile, how much of the oil is turned, how much of the oil has actually come out of the rock. TOC, obviously incredibly important. The higher the better in many instances, but you also need it to be aligned with porosity and rock that can fracture. As Rob mentioned, mineralogy is extremely important. You don't want to touch anything with a clay content above 40%, at least not today, because fracking techniques in areas where you've got clay content above 40% tend not to be that successful. Pressure, you don't really have to have overpressure, but it certainly helps from time to time. And it's important if you're looking to have some good fracking results to have some bounding rocks, in many cases, which are carbonates, which allow you at least to have the potential of better recovery. But it's not exclusive to carbonates these days. Another key thing is to look at the S1 peak instead of S1. You may have heard of the terms Tmax and S2 numbers. These are effectively the theoretical maximum hydrocarbon that you can generate in a rock under lab conditions. Not a hell of a lot of use to you unless you're after retorting the oil shale itself, but it is important as it gives you a guide to the potential volumes of hydrocarbons that could be given up by the rock and where it is in the maturity profile. What we tend to look at nearly more importantly is the S1. The S1 is the amount of free oil that's still within the rock today, and you can extract out of the ground. And it's commonly overlooked, but there's an equation here, and again from one of our co-authors, Marlon Downey, presented at AEPG, of working out how much oil is in the rock itself using S1 parameters. But S1's a critical tool for us when we're screening different plays in different areas, and indeed defining the core. To give you an example, what we've looked here is at one of the basins that currently has a moratorium on it, although a moratorium, I believe, may not be in place fully next year, and this is in the Paris Basin in France. And this is a three-dimensional model looking at the schiste carton, which is the lower Jurassic source rock in the Paris Basin. So you can see it's a sort of intercratonic style of basin, obviously deepest in the middle, and that's where you've got the highest maturity. What I want to show is, like, when you're looking at overlaying a number of these different factors, how does it impact where you're going to define the core? So this is the current license position in the Paris Basin in blue. And what I'm going to overlay on top of that are a few of the key parameters that you might want to think about looking at. Using this as a very easy way, because it's got a ban on fracking and unconventional extraction, so it gives us a place to throw real data on it and have discussions. So first of all, let's apply two things. First of all is the thickness of the Torsion, and you can see it's thickest running north southwest in the black lines, and also you want to see where it's got the best maturity. So it's definitely well into the oil window. It's above Tmax of 435, so it's in 440 to 450. So you're looking at just these two different things here to highlight the core of the play. So we would say that if you overlay just those two, and there are a bunch of other criteria you need to throw on this, that this should be your pre-drill core in the play in the Paris Basin. And you can get a lot of this data very quickly from public sources, and we call this sort of geological CSI to actually come up with where we believe the core area might be. Now, to back us up a little bit, when you look at before the ban was really in place, some of the flow rates from vertical wells were performed in the red bit in the center there, and they came out with some of the best flow rates out of that source rock. Again, what we would have considered in the core of the play. Now, I'm sure there may be some in this audience who've got acreage outside that core area and who may be pounding the table and saying, no, we are in the core. We would say, this is just one example. We have looked at the Paris Basin, and we'd be more interested in the hashed area rather than the other bits. Here's an example from, again, going back to the Bakken, as it's a very natural laboratory to have a look at this, because you can look back at all the data with a lot of hindsight. This is looking at the IPs, or initial production rates, of gas in the Bakken. So if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see IPs of over 2.5 million cubic feet a day, and these are these dark red areas, right down to under 500,000 cubic feet a day in the blue areas. So we would classify the bits in the core as having the highest flow rates and the bits on the periphery as having the lowest flow rates. Now what's important here is if you used all of the equations and petrophysical parameters and geochemical parameters that you would have had back then, you would have defined these counties in green as the places to lease. If you had actually applied a little bit of science rather than doing a land grab, that's where you would have gone after. Now actually on the post-drill, when you've drilled all those wells, you would define in red probably where the core of the Barnett actually is. So you can get a pretty good overlap if you apply the science at the very beginning. Now the reason why this is very important is the fact that a well in the core will have an IRR of 30%. A well outside the core will have an IRR of -2%. And this is, I suppose, the key here. It's twofold. One, you have to establish the geologically best area to go and lease. Secondly, by going in early and leasing the geologically best area, you're getting in at the lowest acre dollar per acre rates and the lowest royalty rates. If you come in later on and you go after the core once it's been established, you won't have an IRR of 30%. You'll probably have an IRR of 5 to 10% because you've bid away all that price by going in late on in the game. If you're really stupid and you go in late in the day and you pay very high prices, and I know we're all laughing, I can, off record, I'll point to numerous examples of people that have gone in and bought moose pasture out here for very large amounts of money because they just didn't understand the science. And I think what's more important now going forward, as you move outside some of the plays that have been the easiest plays, like for example, if you look at the Bakken, 50 years ago, the Bakken was a test case for geochemistry and petroleum engineering and for petroleum generation in textbooks and lectures in universities. That was one of the reasons it was sought after the first. If you go to many other areas, I think a lot more science will need to be applied, especially where you don't have good well control and core data. So science is going to be very important going forward. And indeed, it's a new breed of exploration where instead of I suppose the geophysicists being key with 3D seismic, and 3D is very important for unconventional as well, it's going to see the rise of the geochemist, if there are any left in the world. And that's going to be important critically over the next 5 years. So in summary then, I think the key thing is just to leave you with an idea that there is plenty to go after out there. You can define the best basins largely around the basins that have been the most successful in the world from a conventional point of view, because they usually have been driven by the best source rocks in the world. When you're defining the core area, it is absolutely critical to have your own science and your own databases which will establish what you believe are the critical factors based on past examples and analogues in the basins that have worked in North America to apply to basins both in North America that haven't been exploited yet for unconventional resources and throughout the world. The key thing is going to be as you move outside North America where the well density is so much less than North America, the science element is going to become more and more and more important because you need to know these critical factors when you're looking at only a handful of wells that have penetrated the source rock in many areas outside the US. So many thanks for your attention and time, and please take any questions.
Okay, any questions? Yeah, let's start. Carl, yeah. Oh. Yeah, no, it's okay. I thought you were...
Irina Katiani from Sato. Thank you, the presentation was great. I have a question around the first part of around the conclusions. You mentioned, I think, quite a golden number of recovery factor, around 5% for oil. What do you think are the chances of that recovery factor increasing by, let's say, another 5%?
I think give it long enough, and absolutely you're going to get there. I think there's a number of things. First of all, we've moved from a situation where we've been exclusively fracking dolomite or carbonates with some dolomitic element into now fracking the shales and fracking shales with porosity of like 3, 4, 5%. But there used to be a cutoff with shales that you don't touch anything under 6% porosity. Now we're going right down to 2% porosity and planning where the fractures are going to come in. So I think from a technological point of view, there's still a long way to go as we understand the science. The second thing on recovery factor is, I think the most important is understanding kerogen porosity. Understanding that as the kerogen, as the organic matter turns into kerogen within the rocks, how much of it actually is in the matrix porosity itself. That science is totally embryonic. So I think once that's understood and a mechanism to really go after that is found, then yes, you could double that recovery factor above 5%, but it's going to take a long time to do that. And it'll start first in the best source rocks and then migrate outside. Like you've got a distinct advantage of being in the Bakken. And you know, I would encourage you to start spending lots of Statoil's money trying to solve that problem. It would be a benefit to all of us.
Yeah, please, over here.
Very interesting analysis. How do you account for the fact that the Bakken works in an awful lot of places it shouldn't by that analysis, the analysis you used in the Paris Basin there?
The Bakken works not. I would argue that in many instances it actually is working as you would expect. Like you've got two things that are happening. First of all, you're chasing the dolomite layers. Secondly, you're now chasing more and more the shale layers as well. The basin as a whole is a very high source rock basin. Now, if you jump to other areas like the Southern Alberta Bakken, the Heath, if you go to the west and to the south of the Bakken and up to the north of the Bakken, that's had more dodgy results because it's been a lot thinner and it doesn't have the same source rock characteristics in terms of being organic rich. I think if you looked at the Bakken in its own right, even some of the fringes of the Bakken you would probably take for other areas of the US because it's so unique in terms of its characteristics. But in most cases in the Bakken, I would say they pretty much map to petrophysical data. The one area we've noticed where it's very clear that the results are, I suppose, dubious versus what you would have done going into is the Niobrara in Colorado. There you've got very different results which you would not have expected. And I think that a lot of that is related to structure. I think more and more as people are taking 3Ds over these areas, you're starting to see that the intersection of fractures you would not normally have seen drilling your initial horizontal wells without the 3D are becoming more and more important. So I think if you layered on top of the geochemical, the petrophysical, and you add a bit of structure on top of it, it would probably explain for most of the things you're currently seeing.
Anybody else? Neil, let me ask you a question. I mean, you emphasised a couple of times the sort of skills base that's needed. Yeah. As I say, one of the things I do is dig around the literature and the internet a lot. And my impression is that the skill base in regional geology and the science, which you've described in the US, is much deeper in the US than it is in Europe. And you can look at somebody like your partners, Roxana, and say, incredibly talented. And to be provocative, I don't see any company in Europe that has that sort of skill base, apart from yourselves, but of course you're accessing Roxana. Do you agree with that, or is that an extreme exaggeration?
No, I think that's if you go back to the US and Canadian oil and gas industry, it's an industry that basically has always still worked onshore. While most of the money moved offshore, there still was a mom and pop industry around, and people still made reasonable money because the United States is so well endowed with resources. It's really an enigma, to be honest. But I think there was such a a basic regional geology style of education and of doing business that kept on going when people moved offshore, that has given them a massive advantage. We see our main competitors as being private oil and gas companies, not the big public oil and gas companies, but it's the privates, some of the mom and pop operators who have production, and all of a sudden on their leases you've got unconventional. They've got great views of their basins and they really understand them. Whereas if you go outside, it's been more a geophysical-led world, which frankly, certainly when I worked for bigger companies, there wasn't that element of we need to understand the basin, we need to understand the source rock. It was more let's just track where the reservoir rock might be and just drill it and hope. So I do think that it's a skill base that can be learned if you know what to go after. We've certainly benefited a massive amount by being involved with Roxana, who got people into the Barnett, the Marcellus, the Woodford at very, very early stages. But it's a skill set that can be picked up, but it's nearly a back to basics skill set that I encourage people to look at rather than a modern geophysically led skill set.
Okay, very good. Okay, anybody else? Okay, thank you, Neil.